I'll get us going as people are walking back to their seats. Good morning, I'm Valerie Jennis, Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society here at the University of California, Irvine. I'm really pleased to be asked to chair this panel, and before I introduce the panelists, I want to just pause for a minute and thank the organizers who have put inordinate amounts of time into creating this moment and this incredibly important discussion that we're having. So I want to thank Professors Carol Saron, Cheryl Maxson, Song Richardson, and Jeff Ward, and I think they're all in the room, so if we could just give them a round of applause. And when they asked me to chair this panel, I said, sure, no problem. And then as the bios started coming in, I thought, oh, wow, this is what my mother called lots of brain power and experience combined. So this panel's going to be quite a treat. I was asked to just do one-sentence intros, and because I'm going to do a one-sentence intro, I really beg you to go online and look at the full bios. This is an incredibly accomplished group of people who are in many ways at the center of the institutions that are being talked about this morning. So I'm very excited. We're going to go in the order in which people are arrayed here up at the panel. We're going to start with Lisa Dugard, who is the director of the Public Defenders Association. Oh, we're reversing already, aren't we? Let me reverse that. This is what they do to chairs, just to throw them off. We're going to start with Sue Rohr, who is the executive director of Washington State Criminal Justice Training. She's also the sheriff, former sheriff in Washington State. Then we will move to Lisa Dugard, who is the director of the Public Defender Association in Seattle. She's also served as co-chair of Seattle's Community Police Commission. Then we will listen to Christy Lopez, who is deputy chief in the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, and a lead person on post-Ferguson. We will then move to Arif Alakan, who is the director of Constitutional Policing and Policy, and I would add the highest-ranking civilian commander in the Los Angeles Police Department. I was told one sentence per person, but I'm an academic and I always go a little over. I can't resist saying I take particular pride in introducing Arif because he is a University of California, Irvine Social Ecology, Department of Criminology, Law and Society alumnus, and he makes us very, very proud. And then we will turn to Jeff Robinson, who is Deputy Legal Director and the Director of the ACLU's Center for Justice. So this really is a very impressive and powerful panel, and I will turn it over to Sue.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to follow Wes, and this is my PowerPoint. I know my technological limitations, so I try not to overstretch. I'm a little bit intimidated. You said we're big on brain power and experience. I would be on the experience side. I was a cop for 33 years, just so you have a frame of reference for where my ideas and opinions come from. Worked my way up through the ranks, was the elected sheriff for 2 terms, then went to the Criminal Justice Training Commission. In Washington, we're unique. We have a single academy for all local police agencies. So I trained for about 300 different police departments. That's my background coming into this. I also learned a lot when I was on the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. So I've had the luxury of learning from a lot of people, and as I told several people, just listening to that first panel was worth the trip coming up here. I would have paid my own way just to hear what they had to say because it was so relevant. I'm going to just focus on a couple of points that I would want you to consider as you're going forward with your work about how to most effectively impact and improve policing in this country. And I want to remind folks, we talk about policing as one big monolithic thing, national trends in policing, and I think that's fine, but we've got to remember that policing is hyper-localized. That is the way that our country is structured. We have, depending on which research you read, between 16 and 18,000 police departments in this country. 9,000 of those police departments have less than 10 officers. The environments in which they operate are dramatically different from what I call mega agencies like LAPD, NYPD, Chicago PD, tens of thousands of police officers in highly urban, highly populated areas to very tiny rural agencies scattered all over the country. Their missions and their challenges are dramatically different, and that's just, I think, kind of obvious. Unions play a huge role. We can't forget that. And the union power in different parts of the country is very different, and the level of influence is very different. So keep that in mind. The leadership of police departments varies greatly, from highly educated chiefs and sheriffs with PhDs and a great deal of experience to a chief or a sheriff who may have 2 or 3 years experience in a high school education. You have a very broad range of the leaders that are involved in policing. The laws from each state are so dramatically different. The protocols for investigating deadly force and things like that are dramatically different. So as we talk about what we need to do to improve policing, please don't lose sight of the context in which this all takes place. One of the lessons I've learned over the years as a cop, as a leader, and at this point as a trainer, culture trumps policy. Always, always, always. And it especially trumps policy in policing because the vast majority of what police officers do relies on them using discretion. And while we can implement policies and law changes, which I think is absolutely appropriate, we can't forget the follow-up in the culture, because if the new policy or practice conflicts with the underlying culture, the new behavior will not be institutionalized in a meaningful way. The other important influence that we can't lose sight of with culture is the generational quality of culture in policing. I was trained by training officers that learned how to be cops in the late 50s and early 60s. I used to tease one of my commanders because he started with the sheriff's office the year I was born. And I said, "My God, you're so old, how do you even walk?" Now I have recruits in my academy. Not only were they not born when I was a captain, their parents hadn't even met. So, but this is really, it's true. It's really important to understand the mindset and the frame of reference. So the people who are currently our police leaders, for the most part, were trained by people who learned to be cops before the civil rights movement. Now, many of us have worked very, very hard to educate ourselves and expand our view, but we can't deny that that stuff still resides in the back of our brains, and it's why law enforcement generally has been so happy to embrace broken windows theory and zero tolerance policing and all of those kind of social control approaches, because that's the way we were trained, and that's what's in our frame of reference. For change to be meaningful, it has to happen from the bottom up and the top down simultaneously. And I'm learning this in real time. So when I retired as sheriff, I retired on a Friday, started at the academy on a Monday. My intent was I just wanted a little retirement job so I could get health care benefits till I turned 65. Unfortunately, one thing led to another, and I'm finding myself having the opportunity to make some changes. What I did when I got to the academy was to try and shift the philosophy of the training at our academy. If any of you are interested in details about what was done, you can just Google Warriors to Guardians, and it'll send you right to an article that I wrote a couple years ago that lays out the changes that we made. But the most important, to explain the changes in a high-level way, the idea was to shift the officers' perception of their role in the community away from this role of the warrior who's there to enforce to the guardian who is there to protect. And I could talk hours about the danger of creating a word descriptor, because now you create a target for people to tear down. But it was helpful in getting my recruits to understand this mind shift. When I got to the academy, it was a very militarized environment. The power differential between the training officers and the recruits, I felt, was a bad model for these brand new baby cops to be looking at. People with power have to force people without power to submit. I didn't like that role modeling that was happening. And the militaristic structure did not focus on decision-making and discretion. And I felt that we needed to move to something that really recognized the importance of influencing officers' value system, because that is what would control their discretion. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I have to insert it because I'm just so psyched after hearing Nikki Jones' presentation. One of our fundamental underlying foundations for our recruit training is a model we call the LEAD model, listen and explain with equity and dignity. I created that model, literally made it up after I did a lot of research on procedural justice. Some of you are familiar with Tom Tyler, who's kind of the godfather of procedural justice research. I wanted to train my recruits on the principles of procedural justice, and I needed to break it down into very simple behavioral steps that could actually be tracked and measured. And so I tell the recruits, if you take the time to listen during the first part of your interaction with officers, with people on the street, you will actually have a better chance of de-escalating and gaining cooperation. 80% of the time, you will get cooperation if you start by listening. And if you follow up with explaining what you're doing as you go along, explaining what's going to happen next, then your chances of getting cooperation continue to increase. With equity and dignity, describes the backdrop. You must be fair and impartial about who you're stopping and how you treat them, and you always leave people with their dignity. Those are really the foundational blocks of the Guardian model of policing. There's a lot more to it that I can't get into so quickly. So that's the Academy side. We have had great success at the Academy in transforming the culture to having a Guardian mindset. We've changed the artifacts and symbols around the Academy. What I'm running into now is we didn't pay as much attention to training leaders. And what's happening is these newly trained recruits are going into organizations, many that don't support this concept or don't have the same idea of what the police role is. So my next big mountain is to approach leadership training in our state. And I'll just leave it at that. I could go for another hour.
That was perfectly 10 minutes.
I'm trying to follow the rules. We're good like this?
Good morning. I have to apologize to start with that I am a little jet lagged, but if I can get on my game, I promise to end with at least two provocative observations. One which favorably quotes Pat Lynch. Anybody know who that is? So I bet you're wondering how I'm going to pull that off. And the other is to make some observations about the limits of procedural justice in accomplishing transformation. Because I venerate the work of Surar so much, I just want to flag that procedural justice is necessary but not sufficient to fundamentally transform policing in American life. So one truth I think about the state of the field is that there's a great deal of valid insight about what goes wrong in policing, and there's much less clarity about how to get out or how we might fix it. And so that is the focus of my remarks this morning, which are entitled Harm Reduction Policing. Using the other LEAD program, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, all innovations that come out of Seattle, King County are called LEAD.
We lead the way.
So LEAD is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, which is a community-based police diversion strategy, is just a case study. It is not the answer. It is just an example that sketches the architecture of a way out of dynamics that have beset us for decades now. Let me just give you the origin story of LEAD as a little bit of background. I am a longtime public defender with Song Richardson, actually worked in a project at the Public Defender Association called the Racial Disparity Project for many years. We were just working on addressing systemic racial inequality in the justice system on a number of fronts. And starting in 2001, we took on the profound racial disparity in Seattle drug enforcement. It was extreme in Seattle, as extreme as in almost any American city. Only Minneapolis and San Francisco, depending on how you calculate it, exceeded Seattle's degree of racial disparity in drug enforcement. But it's also a typical story in the war on drugs in the United States. We litigated this issue for 8 years, bringing selective enforcement motions to dismiss cases against African American low-level drug dealers. We kept winning in the trial court, winning motions to compel discovery. The prosecutor's office would challenge those on appeal. We would eventually win those interlocutory challenges. But by the time that happened, the original set of cases that we were challenging were so sort of far in the rearview mirror that when the prosecutor's office favorably resolved those cases and dismissed charges against our clients, it really didn't yield systematic change. There was no sense that it engaged current policy. So we did that for actually 8 years. In the middle of that litigation challenge, our bluff was called by a Seattle Police Department captain in a meeting about whether we needed to continue this litigation or whether we could all agree that there was a problem and how to solve it. First hour of this meeting, this was in 2005, concentrated on did we agree that there was a problem, and the short answer was no. Despite our compelling evidence, the police, the prosecutor, the mayor's office, the city attorney were not in agreement that we had shown that there was racial disparity, let alone why. But this police captain named Steve Brown, who is the most unlikely revolutionary you will ever encounter, at one point he's like, time out, guys. I have a question. What if we skip to the second point on the agenda, which was, if we do agree that there's a problem, what should we do about it? And he's like, let's say we don't agree on what the problem is, but we're interested in doing something different for our own reasons. What should we do? And when I say that he called our bluff, the reason I say this is because we had not the first clue what the answer was, right? We had the rhetorical civil libertarian answer, which was just stop. Just don't do it anymore, right? A moratorium answer. But we went out and shopped this with our community partners. And interestingly, outside of the civil libertarian zone, community leaders, particularly in communities of color, were not satisfied with this laissez-faire, just stop answer, because they said it is abandonment, even if they were deeply dissatisfied with the inequities in the status quo approach, where white, affluent people with health problems, basically with addiction and health problems, or underemployed people got one set of answers, and their kids or moms or cousins got sent to prison. Just a cessation of that sounded like withdrawal and leaving generations on the street corner to sell drugs, to struggle with addiction in the face of a totally inadequate public and public health response. And so they said that we should go further and that we should ask for equity. How can we get everybody the same kind of response to these problems that affluent white folks have always had? And that's where LEAD came from. The idea was, let's just say that for the time being, we can't change enforcement patterns. We can't overnight transform whose drug use results in police attention and whose doesn't. But at that point of police intersection or police interaction, we can send that interaction in a totally different direction. Wouldn't that be worth trying? Wouldn't that be a way to immediately interrupt the cycle of destruction that had been going on for multiple generations? So LEAD is an arrangement through which, when law enforcement have probable cause to arrest somebody for divertible crimes, those can be defined differently in different jurisdictions. In Seattle, it's drug crimes and prostitution. The officer can, instead of booking that person into jail and referring the case for prosecution, immediately connect them with guerrilla social workers. By guerrilla, I mean social workers who don't just work in an office, who come out into the field increasingly 24/7, make an immediate connection, and that's pretty much it. All the person has to do to participate in LEAD is sign a release of information that allows their circumstances to be discussed on a need-to-know basis among the LEAD operational partners, who include law enforcement and prosecutors, and to complete 1 2-hour intake interview with their case manager within 30 days of the referral. If they do that, the case that would otherwise have resulted in prosecution is never filed. And once they're in the program, they are entitled really to a suite of services that don't end until they need them to end. You don't get cut off by a time limit. You don't get cut off by circumstances. If you relapse, continue to commit new crimes, you're not cut off from services in the program. And there are a whole other set of operational arrangements within LEAD that are critical to its success, and I won't go into the details, but prosecutors end up coordinating what happens with LEAD participants' other cases that are not divertible, that predate or postdate the referral into the program, in a totally different way, using prosecutorial discretion to advance the efficacy of the intervention plan that case managers have worked out for the LEAD participant. The net result has been very positive for participants. 58% reduction in likelihood of arrest compared to a control group that went through the system as usual. 27% fewer felony charges filed against LEAD participants, and an 89% reduction in prison time. Additionally, so LEAD's been running in Seattle for 5 years now. What's notable is that there is virtually no opposition to this approach politically or in neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where we've introduced the program are highly satisfied, both with outcomes and with the processes that are involved. Uh-oh, I have 1 minute to get to the Pat Lynch point. And I'm gonna deliver for you. The dynamics between individuals and police are the most important change, and not necessarily the one that we had planned for, but the one that I think is the most transformative. People who I used to represent who would run from not just the police, but the particular police officers who participate in LEAD. We seeded the program with essentially the street crimes unit, the equivalent of that in the Seattle Police Department, so the proactive bike unit, anti-crime unit. Folks now approach those officers and do so to tell them about their struggles. They're not crime-free, but they have conversations with officers about their actual reality, knowing that officers are going to use that information in a way that is constructive and not against their interest. So let me make a couple of system reform observations based on this story. One, this is the Pat Lynch point, is about liberal hypocrisy. When, and actually I'll just condense all of my system reform observations and sit down. Valerie says. If we are serious, we need to be serious about actually changing things. We cannot be satisfied with a critical stance. And that means that we need to build something to take the place of regressive and oppressive systems that exist because they meet some illegitimate needs, but also some legitimate, or they are proposed to respond to some legitimate needs of neighborhoods for public order and for public safety. For the last couple of decades, broken windows has been the leading paradigm that is offered to respond to legitimate neighborhood public order and public safety needs. If we do not substitute something else for that, there will be a void that similar responses that play into the same racialized concepts of threat will fill. The point about Pat Lynch is that when the officer who killed Eric Garner was not indicted back in November of 2014, Mayor de Blasio held a press conference, some of you probably watched it, in which he talked about the terrible miscarriage of justice that this represented, and talked about his own biracial family and so on. And it was very moving. Pat Lynch called a press conference immediately thereafter, the president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association at the time, and he accused Mayor de Blasio and really the whole political intelligentsia of hypocrisy, and I think he had a really important and valid point that we need to take seriously. He said, I just want to know what our job is. You sent us out there to do this. Essentially, you hired Bill Bratton. You embraced broken windows. You said this is what we were supposed to do, and we went to do it. And this instance is the natural result of the kinds of interactions that that style of policing calls into being. If you want us to do something different, we'll do it, but you need to decide what that is. And so this is my point about procedural justice, and I will sit down, Valerie, is that procedural justice, as typically discussed, gets at the dynamics when the police encounter somebody in a sort of defined expectations about what the job is. If we do not, and it is very important, if that's what's going on, that those interactions be explained, that they be professional. However, just doing the same job, and in a procedurally just way, does not radically transform the dynamics between the police, those who they represent, and the people whom they focus on. And we really have to change the assignment itself in order to achieve a humanization of that interaction that can be fundamentally transformative. Thank you.
Thank you. I already gave you your introduction.
We just do what we say.
It's good. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Where's the button? Good morning, everybody. All right. Good morning, everybody. I am Christy Lopez. I'm with the Department of Justice. I'm in the Special Litigation section of the Civil Rights Division. We are the section that brings those pattern or practice cases where we go after these systems that everyone is talking about and we try to modify them. In other words, we don't do criminal prosecutions. We don't even do civil enforcement against individual people. We try to go after entire departments, figure out whether they're repeatedly and systematically violating people's rights, and then we try to come up with solutions for that in the form often of a consent decree, which is a court order where the court can directly enforce the agreement so that the jurisdiction does what it pledged to do. So I've been doing that for I've been working on these issues for about 20 years. I first was at the Department of Justice between 1995 and 2000. I came back in 2010 and I've been there ever since. I led the Ferguson investigation. I wrote and edited most of that report. I have been involved in cases in Newark, New Jersey, in New Orleans, Louisiana, LA County, all over the country. And I have rarely been at a symposium or conference where I have agreed 100% with more of what I've heard. Everything, for what it's worth, everything that you've heard today about the state of the law and what we're seeing in policing is entirely consistent with what I've seen for the past 20 years in departments all across this country. I mean, it should be said that I don't get to go into the best of departments, but I think that the departments that we go in at the same time are not necessarily unique, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. Now, Wes Gogan talked about how we're in a crisis of legitimacy, and I couldn't agree with that more. I happen to think that crisis is sort of a good thing. I've seen this crisis of legitimacy, as many of you have, for 20 years in certain communities and neighborhoods, and the only difference now is that it's more broadly recognized that we have a crisis of legitimacy. So I think that actually presents an opportunity for us, a really important opportunity, and as Jeff Ward said, we've been at these forks in the road before, and let's not take the wrong path this time. I think that's really important. I also agree with what Mr. Scogan said about how community policing and community engagement is part of the solution to that, and that's why as part of this panel I want to talk just quickly about some of the things that we've done in Ferguson. We really saw that in Ferguson. Obviously, you had a huge breakdown in legitimacy, and we documented that in our report. There you had turned policing into policing for profit. We had captains tell us, for example, that they used to play basketball with the kids, but now they had an ordinance against basketball hoops, and so there were no more basketball hoops. So those were gone, and that was gone. They used to have police substations in the very apartment buildings where Michael Brown lived, and those were gone over the years because they needed to put money more into this, more police officers to write more tickets. Their positive interactions with community members were largely restricted to writing tickets and the negative outcomes that come from that. They were writing 4 or 5, sometimes 8 tickets at a time. They were writing tickets for things like high grass and weeds, issuing a high grass and weeds ticket to a 91-year-old man, to issuing $151 worth of parking tickets to a woman who was later homeless, and by the time we caught up with her, 7 years after her parking ticket, she had paid $541 for that $151 ticket. She'd spent 6 days in jail, and she still owed $550. So this was sort of the relationship between the community and the police department. And we definitely, our work over the years, my work over the years, has made it clear that to break through that sort of situation, you absolutely need community engagement, community policing, many different forms of it. So our consent decree incorporates a civilian oversight entity. We actually incorporated the civilian oversight entity that a task force there had developed during the year that we were negotiating the consent decree. Or 6 months we were negotiating the consent decree. We put that right into the consent decree itself. We have mediation of police complaints, mediation of neighborhood disputes to try to keep things out of court, tenant advisory groups, youth advisory groups, series of meetings between community members and officers, a neighborhood police steering committee, and related police, community policing components. But you know what else we did? We dismantled the entire municipal court structure. We dismantled, we created an amnesty program that has already got rid of thousands of warrants that had been issued. And they're required to reform the entire municipal code. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because it's clear to me, not just based on Ferguson, but on other cases, and the first panel could not have made it more clear, that the community policing is just going to become broken windows too, if we let the law stay as it is. You know, everything the first panel tells us, we have to change the law. It's not going to work if we keep the law as it is. Now, I'm not going to talk, I could talk about pretext stops, I could talk about consent searches, among the laws that we need to change. I agree that culture is important and culture trumps everything, but I also think that law helps create culture. I understand that police chiefs are making changes on their own, but I really believe that we need to change the law. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of force. Everywhere I go in this country, I hear good chiefs telling their officers, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And of course, what they mean by that is the law gives you the discretion, but it's not necessary to protect yourselves or the public to do everything the law lets you do. And I think that the problem with this is that the gap between what you can do and what you should do has grown too wide. And I think that when you add to that things like implicit bias, things like this stereotyping type threat that we've talked about, the demonstrated tendency for police to think that black boys are older than they are and bigger than they are, all of those things, you see the outcome of all of that in these videos that we see, right? That's what we're seeing. And in all of these videos that we see, why is it that people are no longer willing to let the criminal justice system take its time, or to let's see what happens to that officer? Well, because nothing ever happens. The officer, in less than 1% of the time of a fatal shooting, are officers prosecuted. Most of those officers don't even get disciplined within their departments. That's not, that's not in people's heads, that's not perception. That's the reality of the situation. And you can change all the culture you want, and you can change all the policies you want. But if officers are not going to, Professor Carbato talked about this, when they know that because of qualified immunity and because of the way the law is, they're not going to be held accountable. I think that's a disincentive, but even deeper than that, I think it actually creates a culture in which police differently. And so I think we actually need to be changing the law. Now, the Police Executive Research Forum has been trying to do this in the area of use of force. They came out with 30 force principles. The first force principle is that the sanctity of human life should be at the center of everything policing does. The second is departments should restrict their policies more than the law does. Now, that's exactly where we need to go, but they've been getting a lot of pushback from unions, from the IACP, because officers don't want to be restricted beyond what the law allows them to. They're rule followers, or at least we want them to be rule followers. They like that certainty, they like that prediction. And being told that they can't use all the tools that the law lets them use makes them think that somehow the game's being stacked against them. When all we're really saying is that Graham v. Connor needs to be restored, in my view, to its original intent, which is you don't take people's lives unless you have to, unless it's necessary. That shouldn't be a revolutionary concept to us, right? How can it be objectively reasonable to take somebody's life when it wasn't necessary to take their life? And yet we see that all the time, and we see that being justified all the time. So I think that we as lawyers, as advocates, as judges, we have to step up. I always try to make this point when I'm at a law school, because the law students of today are going to be the ones who are going to fix this problem, and those of us who are still practicing, we need to fix this problem and take ownership for it. We have got to change the law. And I know, and although we're focusing on systems, I want to make one point, which is that we need to be really clear-eyed about this, that when we go about fixing the law in this way, we are going to fix systems, but it's also going to mean holding more police officers accountable personally and individually. And I say that, I don't say that lightly. My father was a police officer for 20 years. He never spoke English until he went to school. Becoming a police officer for him was an incredibly important part of not only a path to the middle class, but also a path of being accepted and honored. I understand how important policing is to the individuals that do it. But I also think we need to be very clear-eyed about the fact, because this is where the problem sets in. We pass laws, but when it actually comes time to enforce those, right, when it actually comes time to make those real, just like the woman in the video, what happened to the white woman who, as soon as she started to defend the African-American men, she was put up against the car? There are lawyers and judges in this room who have experienced that same dynamic. The minute you try to take on that system and make it real, lots of forces that really weren't paying attention suddenly become concerned and will align against you. So I think it's really important to be very thoughtful about the fact that we have to change the law and that we have to be prepared that that's going to be a very hard thing to do. But unless we do it, we're not going to be, none of this is real, and we're not going to actually make changes in any of this. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Arif Ali Khan and I work at the Los Angeles Police Department as the Director of Constitutional Policing and Policy. As Val mentioned, I'm a UCI alumni. I graduated 2 years ago from, I'm sorry. No, I graduated in 1990, back when UCI was very different and the world was very different. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that and how it applies to policing in America, and in particular LAPD. But it's always wonderful to come back to UCI and engage in these very important discussions that we are nationally. But more importantly, policing is embracing many of the discussions and many of the issues that are coming about, as opposed to shying away from them as they did when I was a student here in 1986. The world, of course, was very different. UCI was very different. The School of Social Ecology was the program in social ecology. Half the buildings that you see, including this building, did not exist. Somebody mentioned, I was talking to a student about the Mesa Towers, and I said I lived in Mesa Court. Our tower was 2 floors high. And the worst thing that I get very angry about is that the In-N-Out did not exist when I was here. But of course, the rest of the world was very different. Policing was very different back then. The Rodney King beating happened years later. The LA riots, the O.J. Simpson case, 9/11, of course, and terrorism being on the consciousness of so many, especially those of us who've worked in counterterrorism and homeland security. And those were watershed moments and catalysts for a lot of change that has taken decades, unfortunately, to come to some fruition. Almost all the news coverage in 1986, as I recall, was about the Cold War. And for those of you who don't know what the Cold War is, there was this country called the Soviet Union. And they were at this Cold War with us. And that dominated the national discussion, those types of things. And also 2 other wars. The war on drugs and the war on crime. News coverage every night was about murders, homicides, rapes, the threats that were happening, urban cities that were just running amok with violence and how that violence affected suburban homes and the creation of fear. And the reaction to that was what you would expect in a society at that time, which was a militarization, an incarceration, and an expectation that the police were what needed to solve the problem, and criminal justice system was going to solve the problem. And building more prisons and hiring more prosecutors and streamlining laws for executions and other heavy penalties was going to solve this complex problem. Diversity was not a discussion, not just in law enforcement, but in the country. The idea that we needed to reflect, the government needed to reflect their communities, that we needed more diversity in all public institutions, was not a discussion point. In universities, not as much, and certainly not in government as a whole. The idea that diversity could not only bring better legitimacy, but that diversity of thought that's brought into an organization produces better solutions to complex problems. It was at best a secondary or a tertiary consideration. I learned the word tertiary here at UCI, by the way. And racism was not the issue. The idea of community policing was not in the discussion. I learned of it first here at UCI, actually, when John Dombrink was doing research on community policing. I also worked at a police department at the time here locally at Newport Beach, where the idea was interesting in theory but not ever applied anywhere. In large part because the nation was gripped by these other issues, and the society and the political establishment made that the priority. A lot has changed, of course. And as I mentioned, the Rodney King riots, the LA riots, and talking mostly at the local level, but of course it impacted everybody. The Rampart scandal from LAPD and 9/11. And that history is still not discussed enough. It is still not discussed enough in communities, in societies, and many of the people, and you'll see Chief Beck later here today, lived through that, and they talk about it quite a bit. But something to keep in mind, most police agencies are hiring young men and women, much more diverse than before, but who weren't alive, who never experienced it, who may not even know about what those were, in large part because our educational system doesn't even teach them what had happened. And that is a travesty, because the way we are today is in policies, and that's my background, is, in my opinion, a function of two things. The way things are today is because that's the way we did it yesterday. And you don't understand what happened yesterday. And then the other thing is it's in reaction to a tragedy or a controversy, et cetera. And those are terrible ways to make policy. And doing it proactively is what we need to do as a society. So why don't we? A good example of this that applies to LAPD is the issue of community policing. And the issue of the things that we know we need to take law enforcement to a different level so it is more inclusive, it is more collaborative, and it deals with all these very difficult problems in a sound way. If you ask every police chief in America, do you do community policing? And Professor Scogan mentioned that it's dead, but if you went through and did a survey, any police chief out of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America, how many of them would say, absolutely, we do community policing?
18,000.
All of them. All of them. Do they? Maybe. Possibly not. If you ask them, what do we need in law enforcement to change and evolve and be better? They all know the answer. It's training, it's technology for greater accountability, for greater effectiveness, for greater communication, and it's trying new things and experimental things like community policing, like smart policing, whatever the ideas may be. They all know it, and they believe it. But why do you think they can't implement it most of the time? Because the political rhetoric often is about how we need to do things, but has that support actually materialized? Oftentimes it does not. Because training, technology, and trying new ideas is resource intensive, and there are very few politicians who are reelected because they support those programs. And I know this from a personal experience. I was the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Homeland Security in Los Angeles. I know this from my time in Washington. And unfortunately, even though police chiefs, especially today, who are much more progressive than they were 20 years ago, the frustrating thing is they know we need to do these things, and they know there are costs to doing these things in terms of deployment, in terms of resources, because every officer you take away to do something positive with the community, whether it's a sports league or having them do community relations, is one less officer who's responding to one of 1 million calls for service a year in Los Angeles. And of course, everybody wants the police there right away, regardless of what it is. And unfortunately, for Los Angeles, we learned that we had to do that, and we're able to do that actually because of the division that Christie is involved with, the Civil Rights Division. Because it took the Department of Justice, not just to overcome the resistance that certainly exists in any traditional agency like LAPD or policing in general, but to force the political establishment to dedicate the resources that were necessary. Because it is the training and the level of training that LAPD officers go through today. It is the technology, spending millions and millions of dollars for accountability programs tracking early warning systems. It is because of the consent decree that we developed much more robust accountability systems, complaint intake, much more thorough investigations of all uses of force, which I can talk about later, and the dedication of the resources necessary for robust civilian oversight and actual resources to go and have community policing. And that's why LAPD has taken the increase in the number of police officers. We have about a little under 10,000. But I think that we have to be honest about our past, and that's something that I'll conclude with that I think the department has done and continues to do, which is apologize. There are very few police departments that will go to their communities, and the first thing they do is they say, we are sorry. We recognize that the LAPD does not have a sterling history when it comes to dealing with people of color and people in the disadvantaged communities. And we have to recognize that. And that's so important, just like it is important to recognize we all have implicit biases. Because if we want to go forward, we have to be honest about our past, honest about the present, with both the bad and the good, and work together to change these problems that we continue to face, and we will continue to face unless we come together and think of collaborative solutions and be all accepting of different viewpoints to make our society safer and better. I'm sure I'll get a lot of questions, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura.
I'm going to try and address 4 things: law, culture, training, and policies. And I want to say that much of my thinking on this has been impacted by work that Lisa Dugard has done, work that Sue Rahr has done. I am completely impressed with the work that they have done, which I think is critical to moving us forward from where we are now. But law, culture, training, and policies are the things that we need to think about. And I'm going to give you an example of the law in the state of Washington. Because in the state of Washington, it is legal for a police officer to kill a person if, under all of the circumstances, the killing is unjustified, unnecessary, negligent, and reckless. This is not my interpretation. I'm not telling you this. This is the words of the statute. Because unless in the state of Washington you prove that a police officer had malice in his or her mind at the time of a killing, that police officer cannot be prosecuted. And so many people have said, well, we're not talking about the police going outside the law, and that is an important point. When a police officer kills somebody in the state of Washington and people say, oh my God, this is illegal, the answer is no, it's not. And we are the ones who have passed laws like this. And so the hero concept of police officers as heroes, I want to address that for just a second, because it is valid. Police officers have incredibly difficult jobs. And I admire and respect the police officers that try and serve our community. But since 9/11, we have had this narrative about police officers as heroes. And there's a thing about heroes. They get to do shit, pardon my French, that others of us don't. And the standard for heroes is a little bit lower than for the rest of us because they're heroes, and so we have to give them a little bit of room to move in that heroic realm. The message that this law sends to law enforcement officers in Washington is, whether intended or not, you have a license to kill. And the message that this law, whether intended or not, sends to communities in the state of Washington, especially communities of color, is your lives are not valued. At the beginning, I want to talk about culture. This is a very difficult image, and especially for law enforcement officers. But we heard at the very beginning about tracing the history of police departments and where they first started. When you see these badges and you understand where they came from, this is a part of culture that we have to start teaching our police officers about. As our last speaker just said, police officers need to know that this is how these departments evolved. If you haven't seen this edition of Time magazine, I think this cover is one of the most fantastic things I've ever seen, because I can't tell if this picture is from 1968 or 2015. And I think they shot it in black and white and put it like this to make it difficult to tell. I have an issue that I will address just quickly about in many of these presentations or many of these gatherings, a lot of the discussion is framed around, well, what has happened since Ferguson? This stuff didn't just start happening 2 years ago, right? I mean, we go back decades with these problems. And when we talk about the law and culture, once again, that's how many civilians killed by police in 2015. I think we heard that the police in London didn't, or in England didn't kill anybody. That's the rate of African Americans killed. That's what it looks like when you look at men between the ages of 15 and 34. And that's how many prosecutions of police officers there were in 2015. Whether the law was intended to be this way or not, this is a license to kill. So I want to end by talking about the difference between warriors and guardians, because what the ACLU plans on doing as we go forward is with an understanding that you can't litigate your way out of these problems, you can't legislate your way out of these problems, you can't simply use advocacy as a way out of these problems. It's going to have to be a mix of all three of those and more. This is the warrior concept of policing.
How you doing, sir? How you doing? What's your name? What's your name? I'm gonna ask you one more time.
He's asking why, and that's a problem, right?
We probably need to talk to you.
44 calling, one be about
what's your name?
a call for 12,608.
Stand up.
Mercy Court.
Stand up. Turn around, put your hands in the car. Turn around, put your hands in the car.
What I do?
Man, what I do? Y'all ain't tell me what I do, man.
Dude, you got a warrant, dude. You got a warrant.
I just came back from my probation officer.
Get your hand off the wheel. This is gonna get bad for you.
No, man. Hey, Jack, call my people, Jack. No, man.
Probation for possession of
All
marijuana.
right, Taser. 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 Get your hands out now. You got 3 seconds. 3 seconds.
Do not reach. Get up. Put your hands on the car. I'm getting up, man.
Surveillance.
Get your
Show me the
3,
warrant. Show me the warrant.
2. All right, Taser. Get off. Get off.
Coming out or not?
Dude, stand back. Stand back. Get out of the car now. We're not telling you again.
Get out of the car.
You have a warrant. Get out of the car. Taser. Taser.
Get out of the car. Get out of the car. Man, y'all better leave me alone. Get out of the car. Man, y'all better leave me alone, cousin. Move, Fox, move. Really? Handcuff him now. Handcuff him. You're gonna get it again.
No one gets killed here.
Man,
Stop.
quit resisting.
Got him. I got him, guys. Just search whatever he's going for.
I ain't got nothing.
Okay.
If I pick my wallet, man. Relax, dude. Man, give him my wallet. It ain't worth that. Give him my wallet, man.
ID's right.
Level 4319.
Man, this thing is...
Patrick Mumford.
That lady not gonna tell me that I got a warrant. I just seen her. Just seen this lady.
Copy.
Call these people acting.
Here's the deal, dude.
How long I had a warrant?
I don't know if you got a warrant, because you're not who I'm looking for. But here's the deal. When I asked you for ID because you look a lot like the person we're looking for.
Man, y'all is ow!
Okay. When we ask you for ID because you look a lot like the person we're looking for that's living at this address.
I'm going to stop it just in terms of time. What goes through, and it really connects with what one of our previous presenters was saying about how these encounters go bad. This young man is on probation. He was put in jail, so he lost a job. He is now subject to revocation on his probation, which could put him in prison because possession of marijuana at the time was a felony. And so these are the collateral consequences of what can be an encounter of command and control. He was asking questions, what happened? And they saw that as resistance. It doesn't have to be this way. And police departments across the country are demonstrating this. This is about guardians. And what I'd like you to understand here is that, I won't show you this whole clip. Camden, New Jersey Police Department get a 911 call. There is an African-American man with an 8-inch butcher knife threatening people in a convenience store. So this isn't like, was he armed? Did I mistake it for a cell phone? This is the real thing. And if you have any question about whether he was threatening, when you look at this, it's clear. This man was behaving dangerously. The police are called, and they are coming quickly. And do you know what the Camden police did? After spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on de-escalation training.
Drop the knife. Sir, drop the knife.
Sir, drop the knife.
Sir, drop the knife. Sir, I'm telling you, drop the knife or I'm going to tase you.
Sir, drop the knife or I will tase you. Do you know
Sir,
what they
drop
did?
the knife or I will tase you.
Because I'm going to run out of time. They walk with him down the street, and they form a perimeter around him of police officers.
Drop the knife.
They have a car in front of him, clearing the street in front of him, so no civilians will get hurt. And they just walked with him. This is where it gets really
Sir,
interesting.
drop the knife.
Because you will see in just a second, I'm going to let it run till this, there are other officers from other agencies that also responded. They have their guns out, and they are ready to shoot this man.
Drop the knife.
The Camden, New Jersey police are saying, don't shoot him. We have this. Don't shoot him. These are the other officers. Some have their guns out. The Camden, New Jersey police are saying, don't shoot him. We've got this. You know how this ended? They followed him for several blocks. One of the times when he swung the knife, he dropped it, and they tackled him. And he had a boo-boo right here, where his chin got scraped on the ground. No police officer was hurt. No civilian was hurt. And you know what? This man had no prior record. He was off his antipsychotic medication. The officers that were engaged in this conduct were just recently congratulated and awarded by the Camden, New Jersey Police Department. When Sue Rahr talks about rewarding this kind of behavior, this is the kind of behavior that she's talking about. And so when we think about this problem and we think it's too big, it's too complicated, you can't change police culture, that just shows you this is not impossible. This is accomplishable. And as the ACLU plays its role in this, what we're going to be looking to do is, on law, culture, training, and policies, make changes so that we can get a police-community relationship like the one I think everybody in this room would like. Thank you very much.